We can have a test, but otherwise we're still silent. Good afternoon. Welcome to our debate as part of the third Forum of Modernist Cities in Gdynia. This is a conservation debate. It's co-organized by the city of Gdynia and the Pilecki Institute from Berlin. Right next to me is the director of the institute, Mr. Mateusz Falkowski. Over to you. Thank you very much. Welcome. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Pilecki Institute. As part of our institute, we have a program, Exercising Modernity. And it's designed for young scientists and artists from Poland, Germany, and Israel. And we believe that modernity and dreams of modernity are the right key, a good metaphor, and the right topic to start asking about the 20th century and historical experience. So I'm sure that Conservation Officers' debate is going to help us gain a better understanding about what modernity was and what it is. Thank you. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Conservators debate, which is part of the third Forum of Modernist Cities. I'd like to welcome the audience here in the room of the Pomorskie Science and Technology Park, but I'd like to welcome all those who are with us, not here in the room, but instead you're in front of your computers or telephones, because the debate is now being covered to everyone across the world, so you'll be able to follow our discussions about the challenges and questions and areas that we think are key when we discuss conservation of modernist architecture. But it's also about ways for different things to come together, which is conservation of architecture and modernism and the challenges of the day-to-day life and the challenges ahead of modern cities. So it's those topics that we will be raising later on, but we have a great group of experts. Right next to me on my left-hand side is Dr. Christoph Rauchut, who is the Berlin Conservation Director and is also the Director for the Historic Sites Conservation for the Berlin land. Next to him is Professor Robert Hirsch, representing the Gdańsk University of Technology and the Municipal Conservation Officer for Gdynia. And we also have Dr. Jeremy Hoffman, who's Director of the Heritage Department, Tel Aviv. I'm Małgorzata Jędrzejczyk, and it's my honor to run the debate today. We will kick off with short presentations to give everyone a better idea of the context and the area that are part of the daily lives and work of our visitors, of our speakers. So it is about interwar modernism, but equally about post-war modernism. So that's part of what they do. And now I'd like to hand it over to Jeremy Hoffman, and you'll be able to follow the presentation on your screens.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the city of Gdynia for your inviting us and giving us the opportunity to speak about the heritage of modern cities. So I will present Tel Aviv in short before our discussion. So the beginning of modernity is always a question: where and how can you start telling a story? And there is a specific point where something changes. So the example of Tel Aviv is the old city of Jaffa, which was on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, an Arab city during the Ottoman regime in Palestine. And the development or the need to construct outside of the city of Jaffa was the beginning of the ideas of modernity to improve the quality of life and city. So at the 19th century, Jaffa served as a port to Jerusalem and to export oranges that were grown around Jaffa. And at the north part of the plan, you can see these empty areas with some Arab villages existing. And the idea of creating a new city came because of waves of immigration, of Jewish immigrants arriving to Palestine at that time. And the need for a new city was kind of a pressure to create new neighborhoods outside of Jaffa. So 1909 was the ceremony of the creation, the first selfie of Tel Aviv, in a way. And then the first neighborhood was called the Khuzat Bait, had the basic DNA of what will become the modern city of Tel Aviv. So slowly by slowly, during the between 1909 and 1920, the city started developing to the north, and resulting in a need for a master plan. And 1925, the local community made an appeal to Patrick Guedes, urban planner, to propose a plan for Tel Aviv. And the Guedes report was the basic vision for a new city, a modern city, city which is based on the idea of blocks, what we call the Guedes block, or a garden city. And at that time, it was meant to be built in 120 years. It was a very long term, just kind of a dream. And because of the evolution of the new waves of immigration to Palestine, because of the beginning of the Second World War, etc., the need to construct very fast made the plan happen. And between 1930 and 1939, the whole fabric of what became the White City of Tel Aviv was completely built. So this is the modern city in terms of urbanity. So the first style was what we call the eclectic style, Jews arriving from different countries, bringing their own styles to Tel Aviv. And the second wave, after the crisis of 1929, architects came from modern schools in Europe and implementing the ideas of modernity by masters of modernism in Tel Aviv, and building around 5,000 modern structures or modern buildings, which is what we call the Bauhaus architecture. It has nothing really to do with Bauhaus, but this is the term we use until today in Tel Aviv, or people use. The whole city center has this adaptation of the ideas of modernity to the local climate and culture of Tel Aviv. For example, large balconies, protection from the sun, from the heat, adaptation to the local Mediterranean climate. And this whole unity of the central area of Tel Aviv was inscribed in 2003 by UNESCO's World Heritage for the urban structure, the urban planning, and for the quality of architecture. Mainly modern, but as I said, also eclectic is very popular in Tel Aviv. It's not very interesting in international point of view. Then the question of restoration came, the need to restore all these houses because they became old, they became dangerous in a way, because there's the effect of the sea and the sun and moisture and salt, which makes it difficult. And now the conservation plans of Tel Aviv made possible, from one hand, to keep the best buildings as they were originally, and make some changes in others, have additions on the roofs in order to enable the city to continue growing. As we spoke together this morning with the Vice Mayor of Tel Aviv here on this table, Tel Aviv is going to double the surface. So the need of the city to continue and to grow makes a kind of contradiction between the existing city and the conservation and its need, but it creates a language of architecture which is very typical to Tel Aviv. And you can see some examples, of course there's a lot more. And then at the 50s came the second wave of style of architecture, the brutalist, or the post creation of the State of Israel, 1948. So the needs for new institutions, new public buildings were created in Tel Aviv at that time. And then we started conserving not only buildings, but also going back to the urban structure, the original urban structure. This example is the Dizengoff Square that was torn down and brought back to the original shape of the square that was built during the 30s, and of course adapted to the current needs of the city. And that would be it. I think I made my 7 minutes, right? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now over to Dr. Christoph Rauhut. Please tell us a bit about the architecture, modern architecture of Berlin.
Yes, thank you for the invitation to this debate. I'm very much looking forward. And I would like to present to you as a starting point some insights into the current work of the Berlin Heritage Authority and our current challenges. And I would like to focus on the question on what types or kind of buildings are we listing at the moment as heritage. And I'm sure we will talk about the questions and the challenges of conservation and preservation of such buildings in the further debate. And looking into this question of what are we listing at the moment, I would like to focus on two aspects. The first one is that we do have in Berlin, also to its history in the second half of the 20th century, a great number of very large buildings, objects, which have great architectural relevance, are of great historical relevance, but also are a challenge in regards to the question of whether they should be listed or not. And I'm showing you here a slide with many pictures: hospitals, airports, conference centers, all kinds of modern building. And through the last 10 years, we did, I would say, a great progress in listing all of a number of those buildings, since we decided that we, even though such buildings are large and we sometimes call them sleeping elephants, we should look into them, see if they are monuments or not, and also push forward the idea of heritage up to the up to the second half of the 20th century, up to 1989 at the moment. And by doing that, we have actually, just in the recent years, listed quite a number of buildings For example, the Teufelsberg, which some of you might know as one of the mountains, the man-made mountains in Berlin with the field station, but also others as hospitals, the International Congress Center, and also the airport Tegel. And I would briefly show you this airport because I think it's an interesting case. This airport was built in the 60s, 70s by Gerkan Mark and Partner, an architectural office which became very famous international. After that, built many airports. This was their first competition, their first win, and also their first airport. And what is so striking about this airport that you would have a very technical building where you would go with your car, arrive, and on the other side would be directly the jumbo jet, and it was a technical building of the time, but also obviously a very distinct architecture. And it was in use until last year, autumn, and we do now have a new airport, and this building is out of use. And we did actually just half a year before this building was no longer in use, listed as a heritage, also with the adjacent buildings, which are also of importance to this airport. And obviously, this was a very interesting question, since there is now a process, and this place is called the Ort der Zukunft, so a place of the future. And half a year before this process starts, we do list such a site. And obviously this is quite a danger, and there was a lot of public discussion at the time, and I'm also showing you some video stills also with the mayor, the mayor of Berlin, Michael Müller, who had to be in a press conference at the time to explain why we would do that. And but I was very distinct about the need to do that, since this building is of great importance for the history of Berlin, and I'm also sure that we do find solutions to keep such buildings, preserve them, and do find new solutions for their use, even though they might be very specific buildings. The second small introduction I would like to give you is to the question of housing. This is also a very important topic which we are looking at the moment, and I'm showing you a map of housing estates with more than 1,000 units here, and obviously some of them are very important for the history of Berlin. For example, the Ernst-Thälmann-Siedlung. Ernst Thälmann was a very important person in the GDR, at the beginning of the GDR, and many people only think of this Siedlung, of this housing estate in regards to this sculpture, but you can see already by the high-rise behind that also part of this development was the housing estate, a housing estate which was built by the typical means of the time and is also now a listed site. What is interesting is that we can really, by looking at the housing estates at the moment, see the difference between the 70s and the 80s. In the background you see those high-rises, which are the Fischerinsel. This is what happens in the 70s. This is not listed, but what you see in the front, the Nikolaiviertel, the historic, the reconstruction of the historic city of Berlin, or so-called reconstruction, is already also a listed site, and shows how far we go in looking into the history of Berlin. What is important that we always have both sides. I mean, the east and the west. This is very distinct for the second half of the 20th century in Berlin, showing you here some examples of what happened in the second half in the 80s in West Berlin, the international Bauausstellung, so international exhibition of building, and which was at various locations within West Berlin, leading also to a number of buildings which we have listed right now. And what is interesting is that some of those buildings also ask the question of how to conservation, of the question of conservation for the early 20th century history. And this is, for example, in housing estate, which was done by Murabel and Jadel. We are taking this question further. At the moment, we are looking at estates with more than 10,000 units. For example, Hellersdorf. There are only churches listed within this area right now, but it's interesting to see that many buildings have changed already quite a lot, and questions arise how to deal with such big sites. I like to finish with a plea that with all the work we do, we need to do a lot of communication, and this is one of the main instruments we also use in establishing modern or modernist heritage in the wider public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Professor Hirsch. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to be in Gdynia. It happened to me many times, but not in such an honorable company between conservationists from Berlin and Tel Aviv. That's a unique opportunity for me, but it also shows the path that Gdynia went along, and the fact that we are able to have here such honorable guests from Tel Aviv and Berlin, and we can have this debate in Gdynia talking about modernism. Now, I'd like to briefly say a few words about the city and the most important conservation challenges, maintaining this, of course, the scale when we are compared to Berlin or Tel Aviv. History was earlier discussed by Mayor Wojciech Szczurek during the previous debate, so I'd like just to show you the illustrations for that introduction. This is the unique position of Gdynia on the map of Poland in the 1920s and 30s. It's marked with a circle. It's a key part in our very short coastline. This is the explanation why we needed to build the port, the seaport in Gdynia. The new Poland did not have a seaport of its own. And here are some photographs which document excellently how the city was built. This is the advantage for Gdynia and Tel Aviv over Berlin. Berlin does not have photographs from its beginnings. We do. This is the first mooring place for ships, just outside, just off of the beach. Then there is more and more infrastructure. This is the early 30s. Over a few years, we've had the whole city center as planned. So this is a new urban ensemble which accompanies the seaport. You can already see the piers which go into the Baltic Sea, and the port was really the impulse for the construction of the city. And that's the photo which is the most suggestive about what changed and how in the most characteristic location. This is the red dot. Over 100 years, this is what changed. This is the natural bay. You had a wooden pier for people who were on holidays. 100 years later, this is the center of a large city, the beginning of the piers of the southern pier. So this is the history documented in photography, really fascinating. Looking at conservators' issues, I'd like to talk about legal protection and some of the main issues of conservation, just implying certain most important issues. Gdynia has an ensemble of modernist structure most representative for a lot of cities in Europe. The buildings that are in modernist style have very diverse functions. These are all listed buildings. These are industrial. We have public utility and we have housing. So we have the entire overview of architecture built at that time in various countries. Here, all of those types of buildings are located modernism in their totality, and they're all protected in the sense that they're listed on the heritage list nationally. We also have some post-war buildings that are listed. These are some buildings from the 1950s and 60s. They're already considered to be heritage. The previous buildings were from the 1930s of the 20th century. The most important monument, if anybody asks, for Gdynia is the urban area of the city center, 88 hectares of land, which today is protected as an urban area. So not only by being listed as historical heritage, but it's also historic monuments, one of the 116 highest ranking. This is the area marked with the red dotted line, and I'll be back to this a little later. This is where about 10,000 people live, 420 buildings. It's not the same scale as Tel Aviv, but it is a certain small fraction of this type of spatial plan. Also, this space undergoes certain changes. These are conservators' issues, so it's worth mentioning. Not all plots were developed, so we already have some modern buildings which in some way, one way or another, refer to the pre-war architecture. This is Kaszubski Square, and this is a new building which attempts to continue the 1930s. Now, restoration and the problems that we have, quite common in Gdynia. In case of modernism, many people are surprised. What can you be doing in terms of restorations of buildings from the 1930s or even younger? But it turns out that there are quite serious issues, not so much in the structural integrity of the buildings, which is typical for older buildings, but in terms of the finish. You have examples of different facades made from very different finishing materials, and these undergo all kinds of restoration works. These are examples of damage of one of the stone-clad buildings, and this is the type of restoration that we do. And sometimes we have very effective conservation activities where we reinstate the historic shape of the buildings. This is the example of the portico that was originally made of cement bricks on the right-hand side, but for many years it was painted with a very haphazard choice of color, strange blue. We brought back the brick. We have also discoveries. This is the door to one of the post-war modernist buildings. On the right-hand side, you have before, on the left-hand side, it was green with just the round looking glasses, round windows. Later, we found out that this was actually oak, which was restored, brought to the surface, and the windows were aluminum, and they looked like ship windows, ship ports. This is very unique for the 1950s. Also, in this respect, Gdynia stands out. We give a lot of attention to issues of facade renovation. In the city center, it seems that the facades are similar to one another, but there is a great difference in terms of detail, different types of plastering. Sometimes the original facade is covered with something. Here, under a layer of white paint, which is flaking off, you can see the original finish in the form of yellowish plaster work. And we often talk about white Gdynia, but there is quite a lot of original color, sometimes very effective. These are examples of plasterwork finish of various buildings in the city center. That is very far from the proverbial white that we often hear in the context of modern movement architecture. One very important motif of our activities in Gdynia is to carry out research and promotion, and also involving the social participation in modernist architecture protection. We have much more to do than Tel Aviv and Berlin. We are at a different stage. And in recent years, we've been putting a lot of emphasis on the social participation. That's why we have an offering for scientists and researchers. A conference about modernism in Europe, modernism in Gdynia. We've had several editions. The 8th edition is going to start tomorrow, but also exhibitions. This is an exhibition of modernist detail. Mainly from Gdynia, but also social participation. We've only done by the fact that when we have an event related to building protection, we get the tenants and owners involved. This is a symbolic gesture where a plaque that signifies listed building, often with the participation of people who live in the building. Also, when we carry out restoration and conservation work, as shown earlier, we try to involve the tenants, people who use the buildings. Very often at the end of the work, we have an opportunity to do a shot where we see the owners or tenants that are happy and how they were in some way limited, involved in those works. It's also important to maintain some elements related to the heritage which are most exposed to loss due to modernization, like such parts of like fixtures that are often thrown away, like this coal kitchen or roller, various fixtures and fittings of the apartments. We often manage to successfully save them. This is also a source of knowledge about how the buildings were equipped in the 1930s and later. Now, coming back again to the picture of the city center of Gdynia, this shows a certain path, a certain way that we covered. Since the early days through 2015, when it was listed as a Polish Monument of History, to the recent history, when the city center of Gdynia was entered on the tentative list of UNESCO heritage. This is the effect of the work we've done over the past decade and a half. All those people who devoted energy and time to protect modernism. And I believe we're not at the end of that path. So thank you. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to move on to questions, and I would like to start with a subject which comes in naturally after your presentations, because the spectrum of issues, spectrum of ways of thinking about the modern movement in the context of conservation and protection is very broad. You did indicate the local context and specificity of the architecture, so the question I'd like to address to all three of you: how far can we think of the issues and challenges and activities in conservation with regards to modernist architecture as something which is global and universal and in some way applicable to various concepts, and to what extent it is very strongly localized and dependent on the local climate or the local history or the involvement of the local community? Let me start with Mr. Rauchut, perhaps.
It's a difficult question with three cities to compare. I believe there are maybe three main issues which are common, and one was the size. In the 20th century, the building activity was rather enormous, and we see that very well in your presentation. And I also made this point in how large certain estates are, and this is a question in the conversation process, and it's a question we are asked how to deal with this. Is also on the political level. I think many politicians do ask the question, how large can a heritage site be? The second issue is also I would call it comfort and modernization of the modern heritage. This is also in housing a topic, but maybe also to other public buildings, etc. That we, I believe, with the modern heritage, people rather tend to modernize for example, in terms of heating, etc., in regards to the pre-20th century heritage. So people are rather asking for the modernization, and this is a challenge we also face. And the third is the how to interact with the local community, because I have the impression that those who are in favor for the modernist heritage are a different group of citizens we are used to deal with in the heritage sector. Usually, heritage used to be something rather for the cultural elite. And now, at least in Berlin, we do have kind of a turn where brutalist heritage is hip. It's more really the young people who are looking into heritage, and they are asking us for new ways of communication. And this is, as an institution, a challenge. And I have the impression this might be something which my two colleagues also share as a challenge.
I'd like to ask Mr. Hirsch to answer. I agree with my predecessor generally. There are similarities, but there are also some differences. Generally, modernism is specific in terms of being accepted socially and perceived socially. This is a problem of this type of architecture, because this epoch is still continuing. We still use the inventions and developments of that architecture which started in the 1920s. So these buildings are not perceived as fully historic in that sense. So this is our challenge. That's why we have to promote and do social interaction. I remember during one of the first conferences in Gdynia, we had Dr. Hoffman over here. He was showing in his presentation something that then seemed to me to be a little unusual or perhaps not very serious. He showed us children's books where books for children, and behind those children there were modernist buildings. And that was a symbol for our colleagues in Tel Aviv that modernism is habituated, as it were, that it became a certain social background or part of it. It became a friendly environment if it is found in books for children. We are at a slightly different point in our actions, but these are the same problems. We have to explain to people that, yes, modernity is a stage in history, and it deserves to be protected. It deserves to be approached with care. And I think this is what we do. I think these are quite similar activities between our three cities. Another thing is that visiting either Tel Aviv or Berlin, I always realize personally what problems my colleagues are facing, because we see the buildings that require conservation, very similar solution. Bauhaus, let's call it that way, because certain ideas were overlapping and interfering with each other throughout Europe. We don't call our Gdynia architecture Bauhaus, we call it Gdynia, but the finishes, the solutions, they're all very similar. Maybe we are in that happy point in Gdynia that we can say that the protection of modernist architecture in some sense is not very difficult. Incomparable, for instance, with centers where you have very big areas where structures don't have any function. They're difficult to maintain. We don't know what to do with it. Our luxury in the city center of Gdynia is that the existing architecture is functioning. It stood the test of time. People like to live in buildings built in the 1930s. So we don't always see it as architectural heritage, because how can you live comfortably in a heritage building, sometimes in more comfort than in a estate built in the 1970s. So, again, there are a lot of similarities. There are probably many differences as well, but those differences usually are related to different scale. And the problems that Mr. Rauchut showed, that Berlin is a massive metropolitan city. Tel Aviv is also the capital of a large country. And the problems related to investment projects that Mr. Hoffman described on another occasion are typical for a large developing city. Gdynia is lucky in that many of those problems we are not facing. Thank you very much. And now, again, I'd like to ask the same question to Dr. Hoffman. From your point of view, from the point of view of working in Tel Aviv and knowing the conditions of that city and your conservation work, how does it compare to what's happening elsewhere in Europe? Do you see joint goals and joint ways of thinking about conservation and protection of modernist architecture, or are there local differences that show that there is different approach in different parts of the world?
I would argue that the relationship between globalization and local identity is the most interesting point in debates of questions of modernism. And we tend today to move from globalization to local identities. And I'll try to explain. The beginning of the history narrative of modernism was the idea that modernity was born in Western Europe. So people used to look for the origins of Le Corbusier and German masters and others from Western Europe in different cities, modern cities. So the sport was to go to cities and look for modern white boxes and canopies, etc. And even this morning, when we talked about Brasilia, for example, so the representatives from Brasilia said that Lucio Costa and Niemeyer were working with Le Corbusier and Le Corbusier and Le Corbusier. And I would argue as historian, and many new historians argue today, that modernism has nothing to do with the Western European narrative. I mean, a lot of new cities were created and constructed in China, in countries that have had nothing to do with European, Western European culture, or very little. And of course, there were a lot of publications and you know, the cultural narrative still until today is very strong, very influential. But this morning we did a big congress with all the African cities. And I think today what becomes more interesting is finding the local context of architecture. And when I'm walking in Gdynia, a city which I really admire, I admire, and I come again and again and again. And I find myself, at the first visits, I used to look for the modern balconies, etc. Today, I really look for the connection between the houses and the sea, the houses and the local cultures, the stories about the fathers of inhabitants, of people that used to live in the sea and come back and visit Gdynia. And this local identity, I find it today much more interesting than the stories of Le Corbusier finding another canopy. And in a world that becomes global, at this right moment, we are global here. We are in YouTube and direct, and people from all over the world and different time zones are listening to us or watching us. So the world becomes global. So in that sense, I think the importance of local identities is much more important. And I just visited a few years ago the city of Asmara, Eritrea, in Africa. And they were talking, it was an expedition by ICOMOS before it was declared as World Heritage City by UNESCO. And they were talking about modernity, but as a stranger that arrived to Eritrea and seeing the old historical structure and the know-how of construction of the country, you can see the modernity there is so local, so interesting. The use of material, local materials, and local technology was really, in our eyes, was amazing, but they were not conscious of it. So I think this is a point where you have to point and to look at the next generation more deeper, the question of local identities in modernity.
I think the way you answered, there were many interesting ideas in your answer, but there's one that I would like to focus on, which is modernity as an idea, which is manifested through modernist architecture. But what's behind it is the intangible elements, because in terms of conservation, you look at the materials, the buildings, the structure, the architectural tissue, all the physical aspects of it. But there's also the context of how this was created. Take Gdynia as an example. It was an important point in the history of Poland, a very close connection to history. Or take Tel Aviv, where the city was created because there was a need and there were some ideas behind this. So it's this intangible context. It's part of how we think about modernity. And how are these ideas represented in your work as conservators? How do you think you're able to protect this? Is this treated equally to architecture, to the tangible elements?
Okay, so when you talk about world heritage, the term world heritage is global. Okay, what's interesting in the international context? Why a specific city is interesting, like a city like Gdynia? What was the contribution of Gdynia, as an example, of course, to the way we conceive the evolution of humanity during 20th century? Okay, so you can give an example of a country struggling for independence, culturally, economically, etc. So it's interesting because people can feel the connection between their evolution and other examples, because different countries had the same struggle in different times and different contexts. What I can say, as going back to Tel Aviv as an example, what Robert gave as an example, these, I forgot about this. It was just a chapter of one of my early researches for the PhD, the reflection of the city in children books and in cinema. So you can see the connection between culture and people. So the way we try to conserve is to adapt the houses to the local materials, not always going back to the originals, but to the ability of people to conduct and to maintain their houses according to their current needs. So you were saying we discovered that for example, the White City was never white. Okay, when you scratch down these colors, so you find it was the same with Le Corbusier. You know, they in all photos there, all the houses of Le Corbusier are white. So the French government was, you know, in a big problem when they discovered that the houses were brown. So what to do with it? Because there is the reality and image, and which one is more important? I don't have an answer for that. But the thing you should check is what is the value, the attributes for the community, and you always have to go back to the local community to answer the question why it was built like that, what were the specific needs, why they use specific technology, materials that were available at that time. Tel Aviv was built by sand, and you still have shells in the walls. Now you can't restore shelves in materials, because you're not allowed. You can't take, again, sand from the sea. So what is original? Is it about materials? Is it about the community taking sand from somewhere, just building their own houses? So you can just change the sand itself, the material, but continue this work of the community recreating their own houses. So these are the values that you put one in front of the other, and work with the community trying to solve these questions.
Now, what about the conservation approach and going back to what was original, or trying to go back to the original layers in residential housing in Berlin? Berlin is now applying to be inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, and it has examples of post-war modernism. I'm sure we'll come back to that later. But as well as buildings, there are also residential estates from the 1920s and 1930s, and those are listed as well. So how did the work proceed in the context of the fact that those buildings were still being lived in? They were in use, and some of them have had some adaptation to them, and they've been adapted to contemporary needs. That's my question to Mr. Rauhut.
I think we have in Berlin, we have a very good case to look at, since the buildings, Berlin modern housing estates, 6 different estates were inscribed into the World Heritage List now 10 years, 12 years ago actually, and we just published a book on our experience over the last decade. And it shows very well that at the time of inscription and the time when the process started, there was a certain insecurity with the tenants and with the home owners, with the question, what would the World Heritage status mean to them? Will it be a museum in the future, or will it be a place still representing the values of the housing estate, which are social values foremost? And the experience shows that those places didn't turn out to be museums 10 years after the inscriptions, but they are still in a process of continuous change. But there is a greater awareness of the qualities. And I very much agree with what Jeremy said, that architectural production is a local task and a local achievement. And so I think people still do experience that quality, and they have learned a lot about this quality. And so now we do actually have more requests on helping people to find the right color of the house. What is the right product to restore it? Because they understood that some of re-asking this question of how do we design a local community reaffirms the social and intangible value, despite the fact that we are just looking at housing and housing.
Do you notice differences in the approach, or perhaps what Berlin residents think about pre-war and post-war modernism? I'm sorry, the interwar and post-war modernism. Do you think that interwar modernism is an icon or a value of good quality of life? And is this seen as a historic place? And then post-war modernism perhaps is still fighting to establish its own position, to be recognized as conservation-worthy place, something that fits it into the modern town and modern living.
No, I would disagree that we stopped making a difference between interwar and post-war modernism in terms of significance. Nowadays, post-war modernism is accepted as heritage, as interwar architecture is. You can see that by the fact that we are actually now preparing a World Heritage submission for the tentative list in Germany on post-war heritage. So we are already having this discussion whether it's a World Heritage, which shows you that it is accepted as heritage already. What we still discuss is the question of architecture from the 70s and the 80s, so brutalist architecture, postmodernist, POMO architecture. That is a subject still in the public discussion, but the architecture directly post-war is almost totally accepted nowadays.
Is this also true for the wider public reception? Do the people of Berlin understand it like this as well? Or perhaps people who are not perhaps professionally involved in conservation or modernism, or people that have an background in architecture? Is there a difference if you're not a professional?
I think it is accepted widely in the public. Why? Because the idea of putting this heritage forward for the tentative list and as World Heritage was an idea by the public. The public is sometimes further than we believe, which is in Berlin also probably due to the fact that it's a very young city, and it is a city with many people moved to Berlin over the last 20 years. So they were looking for the places to identify with, and I believe that modern heritage is a very good place to pick up your own identity, since although the production is local, the ideas are somehow global. That's what we also did here.
My next question is to Professor Hirsch. We spoke about how the city sort of enforces adaptation of historic sites to contemporary needs. What's the situation like in Gdynia, both for architecture and town planning? Because you did mention that it's not just the buildings, but the layout and the developments in the city center. This is part of the city's layout, and that's very important. So what sort of problems or challenges do you face on a daily basis as you try to protect individual buildings, but also when you think about what the needs are of the city and the fact that the city center is a consistent structure? I think that the city center is pretty well shaped, even though it's been 80 years since the first foundations were built. I think this part of the city is doing very well. And if you walk around the city center, you'll see that we are restoring and adapting them, but they are still continuing their original functions. Flats are lived in, shops are traded in, so the architecture has worked. The modernity of the 1920s and 30s actually meets the requirements of today. must be a bit of a phenomenon. And even some of the solutions they had in the 1930s are much more friendly than today's solutions. Here's an example I like to quote. The modernist buildings in Świętojańska Street, for example, the steps in the staircase are much lower than what is required today, which makes them more comfortable. If you're an older person, you can easily walk up several flights of stairs without having to use the lift. And the same requirements in today's buildings are less friendly. So this makes us certain that the architecture sort of defends itself, because it proves that it meets the requirements which it was originally supposed to meet. Now, the port, that's a different story. Remember that before the war, they were two different worlds, the port and the city. And the relations were sort of up and down. And it's the same today. The city center is pretty well established. It holds on to its original functions. There isn't much need for any upgrades or modernization. We will only do the occasional things like to put in an extra lift to make it more comfortable. But the port is a different space. It still operates as a port, and it has some listed buildings there, but they have to be modernized to the current needs.
But the scale of those modernizations that are needed is quite considerable in order to meet the requirements of port operations. And here the problems of conservations are entirely different. It's not so good in the port as it is in the city center, but it's quite understandable because we are talking about a strictly operating industrial area, which is important for the city and its functioning. So it's a fairly natural thing that there is some sort of play and some sort of, as it were, conflict or argument between the city and the port and the protection. In the city center itself, there are not so many issues. In those areas where there is intensive business activity, there are considerably more conflicts and issues. What is the situation in Tel Aviv? I remember that within the White City, there's quite a lot of interference and change in the original substance. So what is an attempt on your side to find the balance between the expectations of the tenants and owners of the various buildings on the one hand, and the care of maintaining the original substance in the original shape on the other hand?
You know, I was thinking when Robert showed the slide of a new building in the existing fabric, and we had the same dilemma, because it could be contemporary architecture, what might be someday recognized as a value, maybe, we don't know. On the other hand, we are asking ourselves whether we should keep the same language of architecture. And Robert was saying it's more or less keeping the language, right? This is the exact quote. Now, what's the difference between more and less? So I'm just presenting questions we are dealing with. So we got to a point where we made a decision about trying to solve the question of the DNA of the city. What is the essence of DNA which we should keep? Now, it's arguable, of course. You can have a lot of ideas about it. There's a question of evolution. But we decided to have strict regulations for new construction in the city. Because of this, in Hebrew we call it balagan, it's like mess. You know, every architect comes with his ideas and depends on where he was visiting the last months, not in Corona, but before. And you know, you bring something new to the city. So this is the first question: how you keep the DNA of a city? What are the values that, you know, that are continuous in history and of specific society? Like, for example, we have balconies in Tel Aviv, but you have balconies also in Gdynia. I really love them. They're completely different because the climate is different. You have winter, which is completely cold. You have to be chilled. You have to be closed. Everything. Tel Aviv is open. You have to open everything to. And one of the tools we're using in front of the public, Christoph was talking about what he recalls as non-post-war architecture, but still brutalism. So when we wrote a new book about brutalism in Tel Aviv, so people hated it. You know, they really hate this concrete. You know, and it represents a little bit the beginning of the state, and we were a little bit communist. I mean, democratic, but you know, the state was very strong. And people argued that brutalism is brutal. So I tried to say something. So I was saying, I went back to Le Corbusier, and I said, no, it's not brutal. It's not about being brutal. It's about du vin brut, is brut wine. And the idea of Le Corbusier was, it's very French, the term vin brut, is meaning that when you make a wine, you know, all wines we are drinking are mixed, a mixture of different types of raisin. And the wine brut is the way it gets, it's the original, the way it gets out from I do know what you call it. And people started looking differently at the architecture. So this is the quality of wine. It's nice, this concrete. People started loving it. So you go from material and, on the other hand, to the question what it represents. If it represents independence, struggle for independence, or does it represent, you know, the authority of the country? And so there's the trauma from one hand and the positive aspects of memory. So what we're trying to work with is to work with memory, to try and find something that unites people towards specific ideas, because architecture always represents memories for people. You're talking about children, talking about a larger society. So in that term, you can see the change. You can see the change. Sometimes you want to destroy everything that was in the previous generation because you hate the father, the mother, you want to kill them. And so if you stop, you wait. You know, in French Revolution, they wanted to destroy all the palaces, the French kingdom palaces. So they started destroying everything, and then it was the beginning of conservation, because suddenly they stopped and they said, it doesn't belong to the king, it belongs to us. It's our palace, so let's keep it. Let's stop destroying it. So it's a little bit this process on which we're trying to work with. Now we work with, UNESCO is talking about HUL approach. It's the new approach, historical urban landscape. Now it's exactly 10 years that it was manifested for the first time. So we're trying with the idea of HUL, understanding that a city is an object that is constantly changing. You don't make museums anymore. It can't happen. So the idea of evolution of different layers, you have different layers in the city and you have to see more and more layers. Now we're talking about postmodernism. What is postmodernism? What's the values of postmodernism? For example, Centre Pompidou in Paris, okay, 1977. Would you inscribe it as historical building? You wouldn't, because otherwise you can't touch it, you can't change it, like people like us won't let you do anything. But on the other hand, you know it's a part of history of the city. You can't imagine a city like Paris, for example, without Pompidou. You can't destroy it tomorrow. So where's the point when you inscribe something, okay? When you put it into value. So they have a system, label it's called. You just put a label. You don't inscribe it. Just put label 20th century saying this is important. So we're trying to create new frameworks like that, to start with small labels and not going all the way.
Il y
So, in that case, what was the label that you wanted to use and that you did use with regards to the two urban complexes, urban ensembles, and two examples of housing estates? So IBA, so Interbaustadt from 57, and Karl-Marx-Halle also in Berlin. So two urban areas which you are trying for which you're trying to acquire the World Heritage from UNESCO. What was the DNA that you wanted to maintain, highlight in terms of those two areas?
I think there are two answers I have to give. One is first on Jeremy, because I believe we are going a slightly different way in dealing with the 20th century heritage, in that we're not just saying it's a 20th century, but we are going at the moment, I would say, the full way. We are listing buildings which have been finished in the 90s already, and saying this is a heritage site and we have to deal with it with our instruments of conservation and preservation. There are questions arising doing such things, but I say we also have to be courageous as a discipline to and maybe be a bit ahead of the time. But this is obviously a strategy one can discuss, I have to admit. In regards to your question, I have to specify that we are not trying to inscribe the International Bauausstellung of 84 into the World Heritage List, but the one of 1957. Berlin has a story of international building exhibitions, which is maybe also one story to be told. And what is our focus? There was already a try to put those sites forward on the tentative list in 2013. And at the time, the focus was that you would have the Interbau on the west side and the Karl-Marx-Allee on the east side of the city, and that you would have somehow a reaction of doppeltes Berlin, Berlin twice, you could call it, that you had two developments at the same time. And what we learned about the last 7-8 years in a number of conferences and such is that it's more complicated, and it's not just one and the other. It's also not first here something, then there something, and then again something there. It's very much intervened together, and we are now using the historic urban landscapes as an idea, and saying what is interesting about what is happening in Berlin after 1945 in the 50s and the 60s is that you have a number of different approaches on how to rebuild a totally destroyed city. So it's this reconstruction of a metropolitan city with large urban interventions, and they all do have different planning theories behind them. And by doing that, we can actually define almost 5 different ideas at the moment, and saying, and we're saying there's no place other where you would have such a density of very, very different ideas and variations of those ideas. So it's more this idea than the architectural or the political idea which we are putting forward now for the tentative submission.
Well, also in Gdynia, modernist architecture is supported largely by the local inhabitants, and you created a sort of local brand out of modernism that attracts not only the people of Gdynia, but also is a magnet and a trademark in Poland. Gdynia, a modernist city, a modern city, an interesting destination for tourism through its modern architecture. How do you see the role of modernism in the context of using this potential for the development of the city and in thinking about the city as attractive, interesting, original for tourism? Offering modernist architecture is something unique also on national scale in Poland. Yeah, we do see that over the past 10, 15 years, there is increased interest in the city. In the past, Gdynia was a city which was mainly associated with the sea, with certain attractions related to seaside tourism. Now, increasingly often, we have people visiting as study visits or tourist visits that focus or are related to the architectural heritage. So people are attracted by modernist architecture, people who want to learn more about it. One good example is our guest, Jeremy Hoffman, has been here for the fourth or fifth time, probably not the last time. We've had many more guests for our modernist conferences. They keep coming back to Gdynia. So every time you meet that city, every time you visit that city shows you a new face. So Jeremy said that he once looked for the international thread. Now he's looking for the local features. And that's the same with people who visit the city. All kinds of excursion and guided tours are very popular, and there is a lot of offering related to sightseeing, not only for people from outside of Gdynia, but also for the inhabitants of Gdynia. Gdynia people are very proud of where they live. They want to learn more, and this is a certain capital that's worth tapping. You did ask about social, non-material issues, and this is, again, a certain phenomenon typical for Gdynia. People who live here identify with the city. Even if they're indifferent about modernism, they're not indifferent about the history of the city. The unusual history of the city are a source of pride, a civic pride. So the interest in modernist architecture is happening because the people who live in Gdynia want the buildings protected. So there is tourism, but there's also increased interest in Gdynia, in Poland, and also outside of Poland. It is a certain process that was started a decade and a half ago, and it comes from a consistent set of activities. First, the city center was listed, then it became a historic monument. All this has some sort of social resonance, and it reaches a broader group of audience, and we hope that further steps that we take will also bring fruit in a similar form. Gdynia being listed on the tentative list shows that Gdynia is on a par with other centers that are better known for their heritage. And then suddenly, modernist Gdynia. It's one of the 6 sites out of Poland which are on the UNESCO tentative list. It's not the end of what we're doing, but we already see that Gdynia as a brand being much more widely known than before. So how much has the popularity and the brand be a threat to the city in the context of gentrification, in the context of growing rents, a certain exclusivity of some parts of the city? Do you see such threats? Perhaps. We do know examples of such cities where tourism is becoming stifling. Barcelona is one such example. Cities that find it difficult to cope with the huge influx of people who come for a short stay. But we're not at that stage, and I don't know if we ever will be. It's perhaps related to the specificity of the city and the location. Gdynia is generally located in a tourist area. This is an area that's attractive touristically. So Gdynia is not the destination, but people go to the north, to the coast, to Pomerania, and Gdynia is one of the destinations in their itinerary. That is why the tourist traffic is fairly well distributed throughout the area. So I don't think this should cause any serious problems in the close future. But Gdynia, of course, is not free from such phenomena as we see in other city centers, like high rent, appreciation of the real estate value. But I think these are natural processes. For the time being, we do not see problems that would result from the promotion of modernism and the increasing popularity of Gdynia. Now, these problems, have they been observed in Tel Aviv? After Tel Aviv has been, the White City area has been listed, do you see that this area became much more attractive for investors, for instance? Has there been a certain replacement of the inhabitants in that part of the city?
Yes. We find a big contradiction between conservation and the problem of gentrification, because prices go higher. The more you create stability in a city center, the more cities tend to grow, and cities grow very fast today around the globe, faster than ever. The prices of city centers, rental or buying, grow higher. And it's the same in all city centers. Like, you can't buy an apartment in London or in Paris, in Rome, in Barcelona. It becomes impossible. And the more you put it in listing, the more you preserve it, the more the demand goes higher. In that term, we are in a postmodern era. People want to live in a real house, in a real city, in a real center. They're not interested anymore in new projects outside of the city, or much less. And the more we preserve, the more the price. The more you have a quality of living, the more you go back to the ideas of garden cities, of healthy cities. Now with the corona, we go back to ideas of healthy cities, of gardens, etc. So the demand becomes even higher. So it's a real problem. And on the other side, you have the issue of sustainability, the SDGs, which is a part of conservation. Now we have to speak about conservation only in terms of sustainability. We try to prove and to say that conserving houses and not destroying and building new, this is the real sustainability. You reduce carbon, etc. But people still don't understand it. They want to create new houses, in LEED standards, etc. So there is these contradictions, and the will to construct new housing in the center. Everyone wants to build in the center of the city. So there is a lot of pressure in Tel Aviv. You can't build new high-rises in the center. I mean, it's impossible today. But I don't know how much time it will last. I mean, things change, and we have to deal with that. We have to give some good solutions. One of them is to expand the idea of conservation, not to speak only about this. We tend not to speak about the White City in Tel Aviv today, because we speak about other neighborhoods, because we want people to develop other neighborhoods. It will reduce the pressure of the center. Okay, the quality of Florentine. I don't know if you've been there, and western, eastern part of Tel Aviv, and neglected areas that were considered as neglected historically. You look for historical values. It's not only about beauty of architecture or building. It's values of communities that can be represented by keeping urban structures or renovation. And that's, I think in long term, that would be the solution. Because the more you put pressure in the center, you lose. And another thing is understanding that values of heritage belong to everyone. They don't belong to the people who live in these houses. Because you own an apartment today, in one generation, 2 generations afterwards, it belongs to someone else. So the notion of the public value of these heritage is very strong. So you can feel like, let's say, London belongs to you because you love going there once a year, once in 2 years. It's still a part of your. You don't have to actually live in London to feel it's part of your legacy, or even if you're not British. Or of course, you can give any example. I feel part of Gdynia. I come here, I feel at home. I don't know why. I don't know why. But, a sense of place. But it means to me something. So this is the point where people will come back. And when I arrived to the hotel, there was a booklet about what to visit in Gdynia. So there's, I don't know, a submarine, cannons. I was looking for the buildings. I went to visit a YMCA that you spoke about before, the door with the... Yesterday I was there, and it's 50s. It's end of 50s, right? It's nothing to do with the origins of the city. And you still find these forms of sheep. It's amazing, it's beautiful. It's not the main facade, it's the side facade. It's even nicer. So you still continue looking and digging for these values. And I think in postmodern architecture, you don't talk about it yet, but you'll find with time you will find the same values. Even in shopping centers. I won't tell you, there are some shopping centers here in Gdynia which are beautiful. They have these values of horizontal rails, etc., etc. I suppose you hate them, and I can understand it. But through time, you will see that they have the same values of being local, using... Okay, every generation is influenced by fashions. Brutalism was the same. Everybody read the Architecture d'aujourd'hui, Corbusier, etc., or early modernism. So there is fashion, but there is the adaptation to a place, and I insist. And it happens until today. But you will have to look for it. And what you don't like, you just destroy. It's one of decision-making that we have to make. But it's the public. The public has to say, to struggle.
What about Berlin? What's the situation there? While centralization is not a problem in Berlin, because Berlin is quite decentralized, life happens in different parts of the city, but housing problems and growing in rent prices, that's a problem. So in the context of Berlin, do you think that to protect the architecture and modernism and to carry out things to protect the architecture, don't you think that this also contributes to gentrification processes in the city?
I think it's a two-sided story, probably. The attractiveness of a city is related to its heritage, and we heard that right now how it works here. And part of Berlin being a growing city, a city for tourists, is that it has an attractive heritage from the 19th, but also from the 20th century. And obviously this puts pressure on the market. And in this respect, you could say heritage is a driver more maybe of gentrification, but would Berlin be equally attractive without the heritage? Maybe we would still have gentrification. I don't know. And I think economists also do not know really whether a listed building is more valuable or less valuable. That's what at least I learned. At the same time, we have a different story to be told in Berlin at the moment, due to the fact that there is a lot of pressure on the housing market, and people are willing to pay a lot of money for flats. Developers want to improve flats and houses to sell them more expensive or to rent them out more expensive. And many times the protection of those houses, of those estates, is seen as a mean to keep the original floor plans, keep the original level of a standard of living. And so we actually do have a lot of people calling on us to list certain buildings as heritage to keep the social fabric. And in fact, we are more often in the case that we have to tell people that we won't list their home as a listed building because it does not have any cultural value to us, than the other way around. And this is somehow a kind of a difficult situation to be actually in, because we are asked to make a political, social statement, but the only tool we have is a cultural tool, basically, despite the fact that we do see all the changes happening to Berlin at the moment.
I am being signaled that we are running out of time. So how about if we had some questions from the audience before we say goodbye? Anybody with a question? Let me walk up to you with the microphone.
Good morning. My name is Maria Sołtysik. I'm a worker of University of Technology of Gdańsk. I'm delighted to be here and to listen for those three gentlemen talking about conservation. First, I was moved listening that the white modernists have nothing to do with white. We are in a good company because the ancient Greek architecture has also nothing to do with white. But it is, of course, only half true, yes, in fact. As I want to be specific, I will switch to Polish, as we have nice translators. W myśleniu o mieście historycznym, o przyszłości miasta historycznego, jest podstawowa sprzeczność.
There is a basic contradiction in how we think about this. We talked about it. Jeremy and our Berlin visitor from Berlin spoke about it too. And that's conservation versus development. There is this
szczególnie
contradiction,
widoczna
and it
w skali
is
urbanistycznej.
quite visible when you take
Również
a
ona
look at
jest
it
w skali
from the
mieszkania,
town playing
oczywiście,
or
ale
urban
z nią łatwiej
scale.
sobie
Obviously,
poradzić.
it's important
Natomiast w skali urbanistycznej
at a lower
ten problem
scale
jest
of living,
istotny.
but it's easier to deal with. But in terms of the
Dlaczego?
urban scale, that's
Otóż
quite an
mimo,
important
że
problem.
miasto
Let me explain
modernistyczne
why.
powstało
The modernist
niedawno,
city
to są miasta
was only
stosunkowo
built not long
młode,
ago. All of those
to
cities
jednak,
are relatively young.
one swoją skalą
But because of their
są
scale,
podobne raczej
they
do
are
miast
quite
z
similar
dawniejszej historii.
to
Nie
cities
są podobne
that are
do
more
tego, co
ancient.
powstaje teraz.
They are not
Właśnie
similar to what's being built now.
No i cóż zrobić, kiedy
So what do we do
napór zabudowy wysokiej
when
na
high-risers
centra
are
urbanistyczne,
putting
centra
pressure
historyczne jest
on
bardzo duży.
urban and historic city centers? It seems that the pressure
Różnica skali
is quite
jest
strong.
istotna.
And the difference in
Jestem
scale
pełna podziwu
is
dla
quite
Tel
important.
Awiwu,
I am full of admiration for
że,
Tel
jak
Aviv.
Jeremy powiedział,
Just
że
as
w
Jeremy
centrum
put
Tel
it,
Awiwu
in the city center of Tel
nie
Aviv,
można budować
you
wysokich
can't really build high-risers. That's how I understood what you said. And also, you were showing the urban fabric designed by Getz, and in fact, it's still there. It's been conserved. It's that specific structure or the DNA of Tel Aviv. It's house, house, and then the space in between, such as the garden city. It's not been built over, and the buildings have not gone higher. But the problem here is building higher. This is something we're trying to control here in the city center, but it's there. And I don't see this happening in Tel Aviv. I may be wrong. But I would like to know, how did you achieve this? But in Gdynia, this is a real problem, and you can see it, especially, perhaps not in the heart of the city, because we have continuous frontages, and so that's clear. But I'm talking about other places where there is no continuity of buildings, such as the South Pier. The South Pier here in Gdynia, which is that huge alley opening up into the sea, and it has an incredible value. It's really important for that site. And there is real pressure on the edges of the pier with buildings, very tall buildings being built. Some of them already built. More to the north, a little bit further, there will be much higher buildings towering over the city center. I'm sorry for this long introduction. Now, here's my question. What do you think, all of you, about very tall buildings outside historic city centers, on the boundaries? And here's my question to Robert. What is your vision, or how would you like to protect the historic features and valleys of the South Pier? Now, in the face of the fact that the city is asking a general question to everyone, because there is an architectural competition asking, what do you think this should look like? What are the conservation criteria in that competition? And how do you think we can still hold on to the DNA of the city, as Jeremy put it? Thank you. Who goes first? I'd like to go first because Professor Soltysik has quoted a specific case, and she also made a reference to the architectural competition about how to develop the South Pier. Yes, I think it needs some explanation. This competition is not a threat. All the bad things have already happened, I'm afraid. And we have learned our lessons from the bad experience. And as we take new steps to protect the city center, I think we now better understand the value of the space. And even though perhaps some time ago we weren't really keen on protecting it, but things have changed now. And I would consider this a success. It's also the professor's success, because many people understood that they have to go back on their original plans. I think today we're at a different stage than we were 10 years ago, considering the city center. And it even applies to us. That's people who are engaged in how the space here is shaped. Now, about the competition, can I just reassure you, there is no threat to the South Pier. What we're looking for is to improve the standard of the space. I think everyone feels that it got stuck. I mean, it has bits and pieces of the 1970s. There is no consistency. The designs are not harmonious. Yes, we have some improvements where a car park was turned into a green park, but that doesn't solve the problem. We are just looking for ideas on how to ensure a consistent design, fully respecting the historical context. So we're looking to see what the designers will have to offer. And what we're looking to get is solutions that will fully respect the historic context. So no threats to the space, I don't think so. It's a public competition, and everyone will be able to speak about this. And I'm sure anything we will have chosen will be preceded also by public consultation, because it's such an important space to everyone right now, then that we are very careful making choices, because we don't want to spoil things there. I'm not sure if I've already assured you or not, but we'll see. Good.
There was a second question about high-rise buildings. The question was about your attitude to high-rise buildings in historic city centers or areas of historic significance.
I can, for example, maybe from the German perspective, say that this is an important question we are discussing right now on the level of the German Conservatives. And they have been work on especially this question on to what how shall I explain it, to what steps we should make in the process of making this decision. So we try to establish certain questions, like quality standards in the process of finding an answer to the question of how to deal with high-rises close to historic town centers, etc. Within Berlin, Berlin is a very large city, and we have high-rises turning up everywhere at the moment. So our focus is more on very specific sites and areas, especially related to World Heritage sites. but Berlin already has 3. We are looking for another, the 4th World Heritage site. So you can also see the conflict which will arise in the future and will get more and more difficult to solve. I totally agree with the threat of high rises to the urban landscape, but at the same time I can only advocate that we shouldn't be too afraid. A high rise is a very distinct building, and sometimes it is so distinct that it might not be a threat to the historic buildings, and we have to look into this and qualify this question very thoroughly.
I would like to refer to your question. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm really pleased to see you, Maria, again, to meet you. The question of high-rise, I will give some examples. One of the first problematics we're dealing with is conserving high-rise buildings. Now it's a new issue in Tel Aviv because promoters that own a high-rise, they want to destroy it and to rebuild it much higher. So there is a dilemma. They have the building rights. I mean, you cannot, according to the Israeli law, you cannot take it back. On the other hand, you want to conserve the high-rise building because for us it becomes historical. It's the end of 60s, it doesn't matter. Aryeh Sharon, famous architect. So we start asking about a new typology of architecture which is conserving additions on high-rise buildings. So it's a new phenomena, and the world will have to deal with it for the next century. I think more or less we are the first to deal with these problematics, and it will have to create new architecture, I think, that were not adapted yet to this. We are adapted to urban tissue. Okay, we know how to conserve urban tissues, and it's a new typology. So we don't have any answers for that. I'm just putting the question on the table. Regarding the role of high-rise buildings in the city, first of all, there are 2 types of high-rise buildings. There are standalone that serve only the people who use them, which are very bad for the city because they created neglected areas. You arrive to the building, you go up, down, you go back home, train or car or whatever, and there is tendency to create areas with high-rise building which are very well developed in terms of creating very quality spaces for people. I'll just give an example. We have a German colony in eastern part of the central eastern part of Tel Aviv, which is called Sarona. So the core is historical small 1 or 2 floors buildings. We keep them all, and it makes like a small park, quite big. It's 50,000 square meters. It's not very small. And in order to preserve it, we had to build all high-rise building around to have the building rights, etc. So there is this negative aspects, of course, because the Israeli land authorities, they wanted their rights, and we tried to design it in a way that people will feel good going around these buildings and not stand alone. Creative urban fabric. The most important issue with high-rise buildings is the point where they touch the ground. This is the most sensitive issue in designing high-rise building. It's not about the beauty of the object. This is different aspects, and it's not for this discussion today. The second thing is strategic plan. We're trying to use strategic plan for the city in order that things will be very clear for promoters, what they can do and what they're not allowed to do, So the issue of pressure almost will not exist in the city. And as long as you create good and long-term strategic plan, you avoid this question. The more you leave things or design or planning open for discussion, I can almost say you lose. So this is the second tool. The third one would be the question of buffer zones, because we speak of historical centers, but there is a second term, which is the buffer zone, which is all the area which is around the city center. You showed the city center, but there is a second layer. It's not about size of the layers, it's about the meaning of what is the identification of a buffer zone. And for every site, the way it serves the city center could be different. Like, for example, the sea could be a buffer zone between two elements, or the desert could be a buffer zone between a city in the desert and a different one. So it could be huge at size or very small. But the question would be, how do they serve the core of the city? What is the role of the buffer zone? And the more you can identify the role of the buffer zone, for just simple examples, if cars, instead of parking in the center, they will park in the buffer zone, so you can understand the attributes, the connection between buffer zone and the city center. You can start creating a logic, how it serves the center. As long as it serves the historical attributes of a city, of a city center, you might think you are in a good direction. And if it serves only promoters, it will not stand in long term.
I saw that there were more questions, but unfortunately our time is up. So I would like you to ask these questions after the meeting. Thank you very much for coming to Gdynia. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the very interesting conversation and very interesting observations you shared about modernism and conservation of modernist architecture. Thank you all for being here, and I'd like to thank you all to listen to us and watch us online. I'd like to also thank the hosts of the Forum of Modernist Cities, that's the city of Gdynia, for cooperation with organizing this event. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.